Welcome. My name is Joanne Houston and I'm a member of the EFRAG Sustainability Reporting TEG. Today, I'm pleased to present 3 of the draft EU Sustainability Reporting Standards, and more specifically, ESRS S2 on workers in the value chain, ESRS S3 on affected communities, and ESRS S4 on consumers and end users. I'll be covering these 3 standards simultaneously due to their mirroring structure. And of course, while each standard includes its own specificities and each focuses on a different stakeholder category, they follow a similar structure. I will start with some background information on the context around the social standards, followed by information on the structure and approach of the social ESRS pillar, and then move on to the content of the standards themselves. I'll then conclude with some information on how these have evolved over time from the April exposure drafts to the November drafts submitted to the European Commission, and provide a quick note on the sources behind each disclosure requirement. So let me begin with an overview of the background around ESRS S2, S3 and S4. As you may recall, the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, also known as CSRD, indicates the needs for undertakings to report information on social factors and human rights. Companies are to report on the principal, actual and potential adverse impacts connected to their activities, including those caused by the undertaking, impacts which the undertaking contributes to, and impacts which are otherwise linked to the undertaking's value chain. Moreover, the CSRD points to the importance of aligning the EU standards with internationally recognised principles and frameworks on responsible business conduct, corporate social responsibility and sustainable development, including the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, as well as the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct. The CSRD further indicates specific issues for which standards are needed, including equal treatment and opportunities for all, as well as working conditions, which you can see outlined in the slides. And as provided in this new slide, also on the respect for the human rights, fundamental freedoms, democratic principles and standards established in international instruments, such as the International Bill of Human Rights and other core UN human rights conventions, including the UN Convention on Persons with Disabilities or on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the ILO conventions, the European Convention of Human Rights, the revised European Social Charter, and so on. And all of this is what the standards are really based on: the need for undertakings to report on impacts, risks and opportunities connected with their activities, including the value chain, the importance of providing disclosures for entities' due diligence, and to align with international principles and frameworks such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines. So all of this is really what has guided the development and structure of the social standards. Now, this brings me to the next slide, where you can see a graph that illustrates the structure of the ESRS social pillar. How should you look at this slide? Well, under the topic social standards, there are 4 subtopics for which standards have been developed. These include own workforce, which is, however, dealt with in a separate presentation, followed by workers in the value chain, affected communities, and consumers and end users. These are the subtopics covered respectively by ESRS S2, ESRS S3 and ESRS S4, the focus of today's presentation. Now, within each of these 3 standards, there's an indication of associated subtopics and a list of specific issues falling under such headings. And these are the issues that undertakings should take into account in their materiality assessment. So, for example, when focusing on affected communities, ESRS S3, undertakings may cause or contribute to impacts on communities' economic, social and cultural rights, such as adequate housing, adequate food, water and sanitation, land-related and security-related impacts. But they may also cause or contribute to impacts on communities' civil and political rights, so freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, impact on human rights offenders, and also impacts on particular rights of Indigenous communities, which include free, prior and informed consent, self-determination and cultural rights. What this means in practice is that companies should follow the framework provided by S3 to disclose their general approach for the identification and management of material, actual and potential impacts on affected communities in relation to such subtopics and specific issues. And this, of course, the same applies to S2 and S4. The same applies to S2 and S4, each of which provides a specific list of relevant subtopics and sustainability matters. So the social standards really provide the framework for disclosures on the impacts, risks and opportunities identified as material by the undertaking itself as part of its materiality assessment in relation to the subtopics outlined on the slides. And of course, as a note, you will also find these same issues and subtopics outlined in the objectives section of the respective standard. This brings me to the content of the standards themselves. The structure of these standards, as I mentioned, is aligned, meaning all three ESRSs include the same number and focus of disclosure requirements, but each is centered around different stakeholder categories and have specificities related to value chain workers, affected communities, and consumers and end users. Let me also add that focus has been placed on disclosures that can be expected of all entities under the scope of the CSRD. So the standards provide high-level disclosures regarding an undertaking's impacts on value chain workers, affected communities, consumers and end users, as well as related risks and opportunities. Now, in terms of specific disclosure requirements, let's start with an overview of strategy-related disclosures. ESRS S2, S3 and S4 provide complementary information to two requirements included in ESRS 2. The first is in relation to ESRS 2, SBM2 on the interests and views of stakeholders. On this, S2, S3 and S4 clarify that companies are to report on how the views of affected stakeholders are taken into account to inform the undertaking's business model and strategy, to provide an understanding of how companies consider if their strategy and business model play a role, for example, in causing material impacts on value chain workers, affected communities, consumers and end users, and also whether and how the business model and strategy are adapted in reaction to and to address basically the identification of such material impacts. S2, S3, S4 also provide further details in relation to another disclosure requirement linked to ESRS 2, and that's ESRS 2 SBM3 on material impacts, risks and opportunities, and their interaction with strategy and business model. So more specifically, the social standards in this sense clarify that companies need to disclose whether and how actual and potential impacts on value chain workers, affected communities, consumers and end users firstly originate from or are connected to the undertaking strategy and business models, and secondly inform and contribute to adapting the undertaking strategy and business models. And the standards on top of that also require, in this sense, information on the relationship between material risks and opportunities arising from impacts and dependencies on the affected stakeholder category on the one hand, and the strategy and the business model on the other. And a quick note to mention is that in both cases, you'll find specific disclosure requirements as well as dedicated application requirements supporting and providing further guidance as to meeting the requests of these disclosure requirements. Moving on to the next slide, you'll see the other S2, S3 and S4 disclosure requirements, a total of 5 disclosure requirements divided into 2 categories: impact, risk and opportunity management on the one hand, and metrics and targets on the other. In relation to the impact, risk and opportunity management heading, there are 4 disclosure requirements that can be summarized as follows. Disclosure requirement 1 requires information on the policies adopted by undertakings in relation to the affected stakeholders. In short, companies are asked to describe their human rights policy commitments connected to value chain workers, affected communities and consumers and end users, as well as their alignment with internationally recognized standards. Disclosure requirement 2 is about processes in place by companies in order to engage affected stakeholders about impacts on them. This differs, for example, from reporting on the engagement of stakeholders for insights and views about a company's business model and strategy. And it also differs from reporting on the engagement aimed at supporting the identification of material impacts, risks and opportunities for the purpose of the materiality assessment. So this disclosure requirement is really about the ongoing engagement of stakeholders on actual and potential impacts on them as part of the company's due diligence process. Disclosure requirement 3 provides a framework for the disclosure of processes to provide for or cooperate in the remediation of negative impacts on people that the company has caused or contributed to, as well as the channels for affected stakeholders to raise concerns. The objective is really to enable an understanding of the formal means through which affected stakeholders can make their concerns and needs known directly to the companies, and through which companies can then support the availability of these channels, including, for example, grievance mechanisms. It also covers information on how follow-up is performed with affected stakeholders regarding the issues raised and the effectiveness of these channels. Disclosure requirement 4 provides for disclosures on taking action on impacts and effectiveness of those actions, as well as approaches to mitigate material risks and pursue material opportunities. And the aim of this disclosure requirement is twofold. On the one hand, it's to provide an understanding of processes, initiatives, and engagements through which companies seek to improve the lives of affected stakeholders, whether that's by working to prevent, mitigate, and remediate the negative material impacts on them, or by seeking to achieve positive material impacts. And on the other hand, it's to provide an understanding of the ways in which companies address material risks and pursue material opportunities related to workers in the value chain, affected communities, or consumers and end users. And this leads us to the last disclosure requirement falling under the metrics and targets category, and that's disclosure requirement 5, which requires a disclosure of information on targets related to managing material negative impacts, advancing positive impacts, and managing material risks and opportunities. The objective of this disclosure requirement is to enable an understanding of the extent to which the undertaking uses time-bound and outcome-oriented targets to drive and measure its progress in addressing material negative impacts, advancing positive impacts, and also managing material risks and opportunities related to the affected stakeholders. Now, as part of this disclosure requirement, undertakings are requested to disclose processes they have to set the targets, including whether and how these companies engage directly with the affected stakeholders, their legitimate representatives, or with credible proxies, in firstly setting these targets, in also tracking the undertaking's performance against the targets, and lastly, in identifying lessons or improvements as a result of the undertaking's performance. Now, a consideration to make is that S2, S3, and S4 do not include disclosure requirements on metrics as such, which can instead be expected in future sets of the EU standards. And this really reflects the sector-specific and entity-specific nature of human rights impacts and risks, which really affects the possibility to define cross-sectoral metrics related to undertakings' impacts on people in a relevant and comparable manner. Lastly, I'd like to highlight that S2, S3, and S4 apply to the impacts, risks, and opportunities identified by undertakings themselves through their own materiality assessment. But there is an exception, and that's a number of mandatory disclosures which companies need to report on independent of their materiality assessment. And these have been provided for alignment with other pieces of EU legislation, such as the principal adverse impact indicators of the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Requirement or the Climate Benchmark Regulation. You can see the specific data points are shown on the slide. So you know they're also signposted throughout the standards with dedicated footnotes and are also presented in an appendix of the standards themselves. So Appendix C of ESRS 2 really provides you with the full overview of such data points. As a next step, I'd like to briefly summarise the work that's been done on these standards since the feedback that's been received on the exposure drafts following the public consultation launched earlier this year in April. And this, of course, is a brief summary, but it captures some of the key changes. The scope of the standards has been clarified to more explicitly indicate that the focus of disclosures in S2, S3, and S4 depends on the material impacts, risks, and opportunities identified by companies through their materiality assessment, as I mentioned earlier. Overall, what's been done is that disclosure requirements have been simplified and further clarifications have been made where requested. An example is the reduction of disclosure requirements from 6 to 5, following simplification and the merge of what previously was disclosure requirement 5 and disclosure requirement 6. We've also strengthened the alignment with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and OECD guidelines, as reflected, for example, in the expansion of Disclosure Requirement 3, which now explicitly covers remediation of negative impacts. And we also clarified definitions where respondents indicated such a need, for example, by specifying that end users are a subcategory of consumers or that affected communities explicitly includes the indigenous peoples. And we also include some further clarifications throughout the standards, such as examples of value chain workers or guidance through dedicated application requirements, clarifying the connection between, for example, communities on the one hand and environmental impacts, risks and opportunities on the other, to support undertakings report on such interconnected impacts. And last but not least, the next slide includes an overview of how the standards have been built, taking into account the EU CSRD, as well as other critical sources, including, for example, legislation such as the principal adverse impact indicators of the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and the Climate Benchmark Regulation, international instruments, namely the OECD guidelines and UN guiding principles on business and human rights, as well as other frameworks such as GRI, CDSB, the Integrated Reporting Framework, SASB, and the SDGs. And this really reflects the work behind the standard, which is aimed at bringing together the key elements of such references into a solid framework for disclosures. With this, I've concluded the presentation, which I hope you found helpful. For further details, please refer to the draft ESRS uploaded on the EFRAG website. Thank you.